certainly have fears that there is a serial killer at loose in Perth.
Sarah Spiers, Jane Rimmer, Ciara Glennon.
And every time you saw a young girl walking by, you think, oh God, is she going to be the next victim?
Now, one man stands accused.
If police are right and Edwards is the Claremont serial killer, he's been hiding in plain sight for 20 years.
CSI officers have described how they stripped bare the car driven by Bradley Edwards back in the 90s, searching for blood and stains. Good to have your company for day 66 of Claremont in Conversation. Natalie Bonjolo, Tim Clark and Damien Cripps with you today. So Tim, this is the car we were speaking about in yesterday's podcast.
Yes, Nat, a 1996 Holden Commodore VS Series 1 or 2 executive model, but it didn't look very executive in the pictures that we saw today because it was obviously more than 20 or nearly 20 years since Mr. Edwards had been driving it around as a Telstra vehicle. It had gone through several sets of hands by then and was being used at that time as a vehicle for a gardening business up in Chidlow, which is up in the hills of Perth. And as we said yesterday, it was a minor miracle that police managed to find it at all, but find it they did through the use of the VIN number and various other identification numbers. They managed to track it through motoring records, and there it still was. And today we got into what the police did with it after they seized it, and that was gone through in great detail as it was at the time, because it took police 3 days to basically break this car down piece by piece, almost down to the nuts and bolts, certainly down to the bare shell of the car as they slowly dismantled it, looking for any clues that might link it to Jane Rimmer and Ciara Glennon.
And there were many photographs shown of this process in the courtroom today. Can you describe some of those photographs for us?
Yeah, dozens actually, Nat. I think we counted nearly 90 photographs tendered through the witness, and the witness was a sergeant, a CSI sergeant in WA Police. And it was these photos were taken over the course of the 3 days, and what you saw was for the very start of the process, when the car had just been rolled into the garage at Midland, with the seals still on the doors, and then slowly but surely, every single part of that car was basically taken off it, from the inside of the doors, to the seats, to the seat covers, to the shroud of the gear stick, to the carpet, to the underlay of the carpet, to the spare tyre, and every little detachable piece in between, really.
Yeah,
I mean, as I say, they were very, very detailed photographs. Some of them quite eerie because if prosecutors are right, then the inside of that car and the view, or some of the view that we saw of the inside of that car today, would have been the last thing that Ciara and Jane saw on the last night of their lives.
Yeah, I mean, in my mind, I have this picture of, a car and people dressed in their, forensic gear going over this car with lights and tweezers and magnifying glasses. And it almost does conjure up this image of what you would see on a TV show such as CSI.
That's exactly right, and we saw glimpses of the bunny suits that we mentioned with Brendan on Monday, and the gloves, and the lights, and everything that went with it, and the log of what they did to that car stretched into the hundreds of pages. There were very long days, 3 days in succession, many people doing many different things. So you had ChemCentre looking for fibres, you had PathWest looking for biological material, you had police doing their own searches, you had polilight examinations, alternative light source examinations, anything and everything that you can imagine being done to this car that could possibly glean some sort of evidence from it was done. And today we saw the results of those, or certainly the process of that, through these many, many photographs that were shown in court and tendered as exhibits.
And we know about the fibres that they were searching for, but in terms of any DNA evidence, obviously they were looking for blood or any kind of stains. Was there any discussion on that and what they may have found or what they were actually looking for?
Yeah, so it was any biological or physical presence of either Jane or Ciara, or in fact Sarah as well, even though the car itself was only assigned to Mr. Edwards in the April of 1996. It was pointed out by Mr. Jovich during cross-examination of the witness that in fact they were searching for any signs of Sarah in that car as well. So, and as you say now, it was any biological or physical material, but in particular blood. They were doing the presumptive tests for blood, so any stains that looked like, the stains that were visible to the naked eye that might have been, they swabbed those, and then the alternative light source, anything that appeared under that was also swabbed and then sent off for this presumptive test for blood in particular. And as we've said, the absence of that being mentioned would suggest that it wasn't found. It wasn't specifically said nothing was found, but I'm sure if there had been something found, it would have been mentioned by now. So those tests didn't turn up the hoped for breakthrough, but as we've mentioned before, what was found when this piece by piece dismantling of this car was done was some of the blue fibres that are said to have come from Mr. Edwards' workwear and also being found on the bodies of Ciara and Jane.
So this car really is all about the fibres. Damien, have you ever been involved in a case that is reliant on fibre evidence? Is it something that pops up very often in a trial?
Nat, I think that this, in relation to me having any dealings with cases with specifically associated with fibres, or fibres being specifically associated with the issues surrounding the trial, it's one of those cases where I've had so many cases over the course of the years that it'd be difficult to exclude that I ever had. I can't remember anything specific right at the moment, but what I can say is that by virtue of police investigating cases, they are expending energy to try to get to an answer. And this comes back to the principle that we've been talking about all the way through, that it's the prosecution's responsibility to prove something beyond a reasonable doubt. So they are looking for anything they can get their hands on to give them an answer about somebody who might have committed an offence. When it comes to defence lawyers, we're not so vigorously looking for answers, if you can imagine it that way. So it's less likely for a defence lawyer to be in a position where they're relying on fibres to provide an answer or to provide an alibi, if I could put it that way, for one of their clients. Whereas with prosecutors and people who are investigating, they're looking for things. So they're more inherently going to find things along the journey of the search. And therefore, i.e. fibres have been found and they become central to this case. So in answer to the question, I think it's really common for prosecution and investigators to rely on fibres. I think it's more common for defence-type personnel, if I could put it that way, to be looking for reasons, alternative reasons why those fibres might be there. But ultimately the answer is they're always around, fibres are always around and often the centre of the question about someone's guilt or otherwise.
Yeah, it sort of does raise a question that's been mulling around in my mind, and that is that given the DNA evidence that is already said to be the critical part of the prosecution case, I wonder how important is this fibre evidence in reality?
In relation to this case, one of the things that was at the forefront of my mind when Tim was just explaining the court proceedings today is that every time something comes up in this case, and in many cases, it just opens up another pathway for the decider of fact to have to deal with. Every time something new comes up, it's just another thing that person's got to deal with. And so in relation to the fibres in this case, although it seems that it's everybody's view that the DNA is so central in this matter. The fibre just adds another layer, if you will, of consideration. Another thing that the Justice has got to consider when he's trying to come to determinations, not just about the ultimate finding, but many things leading up to that. So I think, although it's not what we would call the central issue here, it's certainly going to create a further dilemma for the person that's making a decision. And when I say dilemma, I don't mean that it's bad. It's just another thing that they've got to add to their list of things to do.
It's a little like, you're throwing everything in, including the kitchen sink.
Absolutely. If you want to prove something beyond a reasonable doubt, the last thing you want to do is leave the one thing out that might have been, if I could put it this way, the straw that broke the camel's back in terms of proving beyond a reasonable doubt.
Yes. Tim, what was Bradley Edwards' reaction to seeing this car that he had driven around in the 90s on the screens today?
Yeah, look, it was obviously of interest to him. He did pay particular attention when some of the photographs were being displayed. But it's got to be said, it had gone through several pairs of hands after Mr. Edwards had stopped using it, and this was obviously a work vehicle, so it was owned by Telstra. But it was around about 98 where it didn't become his car anymore, and then it was sold several times and also had a change of number plate in that time before it eventually found its final owner. So yeah, as we've said pretty much every time that question has been asked, he doesn't give much away, and I've got to say it was at times a little bit tedious having to look at 90 pictures of the same vehicle. I just bought myself a new car, and I don't think I looked at half that many pictures before shelling out quite a lot of money for it. So yeah, but it's again one of the processes that has to be gone through in terms of getting every piece of information before Justice Hall, before he makes his mind up. And as Damien says, the fibres, they're probably not right at the top of the shopping list but they'd be in the top 5 certainly in the terms of things that Justice Hall has to weigh up, because they are, if the prosecution does what it says it's going to do, they are physical links between Mr. Edwards and both those women, which is a very strong string to draw, because it puts them all together, which is why this case is being heard all together.
Yeah. And is Justice Hall going to release any of those photographs to the media?
Just before your intrepid producer rang me, Nat, I got 5 or 6 sent through to me. So yes, there will be some publicly available later this evening. If anyone's interested, they'll be on thewest.com.au. And the one that might really catch people's eye was the very last photograph to be shown in court, actually. So when the investigators were doing this alternative light source on the car, they did it on the outside of the car. And that actually revealed the Telstra logo that used to be on the side of the car. It wasn't visible to the naked eye, but when you put it under this alternative light source, there it was, a sort of ghost image of the Telstra logo that had been obviously displayed on that car for some time. And that also tied into way back before Christmas when we heard from all those living witnesses. You might remember, Nat. Some of them very clearly and very distinctly remembered a Telstra logo being on the side of a white station wagon that approached them at night in Claremont and offered them a lift. So once again, it's just another piece of the enormous jigsaw that is taking many months to put together.
That's right.
Could I just cut in? Just want to ask Tim something. Sorry, just Tim, in relation to what the court has heard. One of the things you mentioned before was that one of the ways that they trace this vehicle all the way back is through the VIN number, which makes sense, and I'm sure the listeners would understand that as well. Basically, there's a serial number on the car that is dealt with when the car's produced, and then it travels all the way along the journey with the car, unless it gets removed for whatever reason, which you're not meant to do. Did the court hear evidence of that journey of the VIN number? No, we haven't got there yet, Damien. Whether we're going to
we're not sure. We certainly were shown pictures of the VIN number as it was displayed on the inside of when you put the bonnet up under the bonnet. But what we have heard previously is how this journey to find this car actually began, and it began with when the name popped up out of the database via the Hollywood fingerprint, and then they had a name, and they'd been holding on to these fibres that had been found on Jane and Ciara's hair for many years earlier. Actually, they'd been parked, is how Ms. Barbagallo described it in the opening. So they had the fibres, but they didn't have a source. They didn't know where they came from. And then later on, the ChemCentre did pinpoint the grey fibres as coming from this make of car. So when they then had Mr. Edwards' name, a section of the investigators went off and tried to trace any vehicles that he might have come into contact with over that year. That's where they went back to the Telstra records, found that he had been assigned this Commodore at the appropriate time, got the VIN number via the Telstra records, and then went and investigated it that way. And lo and behold, it was still operational. So we have the story, but we don't have all the pieces. If that answers your question, Damien, they haven't gone through the journey yet. From an investigative point of view, but that's where we understand it will go when we get there.
So, Damien, are you alluding to proof that this is in fact the actual Telstra car that Edwards drove?
Well, interestingly enough, thank goodness this is a podcast, because that's probably a question that would have gone terribly wrong if I was a defence lawyer in a case like this, and I had been hoping to cause some reasonable doubt as to where the source of the car, because Tim's explanation of it is very good. Because my thought was, well, okay, we've got a car that's got some fibres in it, and the prosecution are making some assertions about what the source of those fibres are, and that there's a car, but which was very beneficial when Tim just explained. Then I think I became aware, and the listeners would have become aware, that how we got to that car. And some of the listeners might have already been aware of that, but I wasn't. So that's how we get to the car. And it's almost, I don't know what your thoughts are, Tim, but it almost comes to me that that's a better direction for the continuity of their car, if I could put it that way, than actually going through the VIN number, because it's once you've found the person that becomes a suspect, you can then actually go through the motoring records, as Tim put it, and find out all the vehicles that they've had over the course. And if one falls into that category, which it seems in this case that it has, well, that sort of seems to narrow down a lot of the possibilities.
Yeah. Tim, did anything interesting come out of cross-examination of Stephen Marks?
Not a great deal, I've got to say, Nat. It didn't go too far, because it's very hard to cross-examine someone about pictures that they were. So these were. I don't want to undermine Sergeant Marks's role in the investigation, because it was obviously very fruitful and very central at the time. But his role in the court process was to bring in the photographs through him as that witness, if I can say that. So his actual evidence as to what was done was mostly through these photographs, even though he was taken to his log at various stages to show what was done when. So now the cross-examination wasn't exactly fulsome, Nat, but Mr. Jovich did ask some questions as to what was done and the reason for it. He answered them, and then he was on his way.
Mr. Jovich also cross-examined the forensic scientist Belinda Evans that we spoke about yesterday. I'm guessing she was predominantly quizzed about contamination?
Yes, continuity, contamination, those type of issues, as most of the scientific cross-examinations have been, and she was also most pointedly asked about cleanliness, contamination possibilities, what things were done in between different examinations. In this case, Jane's hair, whether they changed gloves, whether surfaces were wiped down, and all those type of things. Just ticking off those boxes. And then her last question was, how do you usually get to work in 2009, which when this examination of Jane's hair first occurred? She said her bike or her car. And I'm getting the idea that these witnesses maybe know this question is coming now.
Right.
Because she paused quite dramatically and then said, I owned a Ford XR5, Ford Focus XR5. She was very, very clear and very, very strong in her memory, which was a tiny bit of light relief, because this diminutive forensic scientist smashing around Perth in a hot hatch brought to mind some images that they'll probably, I didn't think I was going to have this morning, but there we go.
So she did not drive a Holden Commodore, just to make certain.
Just to make absolutely sure. Yes.
We have quite a lengthy question here from Penny. I'll read through. In relation to the so-called contamination events and the idea that the defence was constantly putting forward about a lab under pressure in relation to PathWest, I kept thinking while I was listening to those episodes that the judge cannot possibly accept the idea of a lab under pressure in making all these errors, because that would put all other PathWest test results from a raft of cases in the same boat and mean that appeals would be coming from every direction in the future based on the idea that all their results are error-ridden and therefore inadmissible. I flagged much earlier the idea that this accused is getting the benefit of a level of scrutiny that other accused persons do not get. And then she sort of asks you, Damien, what is the scrutiny for DNA testing chain of custody with other trials you've dealt with?
Well, I think it's a great question, Penny, and it's great to know that people who are listening or are keeping an eye on this trial are turning their mind to a lot of great issues. Well, what I should say, my view is, and I think this is the position, that a judge or a justice is not entitled to take policy considerations into account. It doesn't matter what the flow-on effect of the position they take in relation to a decision or a finding they make. They just have to decide whether they accept that there's no reasonable possibility of the contamination. Those tests are not as simple as what I've just made them out to be, but ultimately the justices or the judge are the ones that have to decide whether they accept that there's no reasonable possibility of contamination. Now, if the flow-on effect of that is that there's that all those cases have to be revisited, well, then that's bad luck. That's what the flow-on effect is. So the scrutiny that DNA comes under in all trials, in my view, it's just my view, is immense, because it's a difficult science. It doesn't lend itself to finality. It doesn't lend itself to a full commitment, and that's just my view. I mean, a lot of other people might have different views, but that's why it comes under such close scrutiny, because people want to rely on it. People want to use it as evidence that they can rely on, but when it's thrown into the mix as something that people can rely on, it's not easy, but there's certainly almost a standard set of challenges that can be put to the DNA, which and often is. So my answer to that would be, Penny, that I think people can accept that DNA comes under a lot of scrutiny in most all the trials that it's raised in.
Yeah, I would second that, given having sat in various trials over the last 3 years, certainly in this jurisdiction. DNA is very highly scrutinised within particularly murder trials and high-level sort of cases that carry a very hefty sentence. It is put under the very, very tough scrutiny, and in my personal opinion, I think the growing feeling, certainly within the justice system and particularly on the defence side of it, is that it is very important now that any sort of DNA test is put under that sort of scrutiny to maybe go against the common misconception that it is infallible, and once you have DNA, that is a slam dunk for any case, because that is certainly not the case, and very probably highlighting of the issues at PathWest within the Claremont trial, I am sure will have a flow-on effect in terms of how people think DNA works and possibly how PathWest operates. But we'll have to wait and see on that.
Yeah, and I guess the
Tim,
reality...
We talked about this previously, and I think that it's really important for people to understand. I'm glad that Tim phrased his answer the way that he did, because it's better coming from him than it is coming from me. But that when we receive these reports, they say things like, and I'm not quoting, but they say things like, the DNA evidence is 54 million times more likely if the accused is a contributor. And on the same piece of paper, in reference to the same DNA sample, if the DNA samples come from, say, a texter, I'm looking at a texter on my desk here and I'm imagining that myself and a number of people in my office have touched this texter, and so let's just say that this report is about what DNA was found on this texter. So it talks to 4 people that might have touched the texter, might have being the key word, and it says the DNA evidence is 54 million times more likely if the accused or one of the witnesses is a contributor. And then in the same area, talking about a different person, it says the DNA evidence is 10 million times more likely if X person is a contributor. So it just gives the listeners a bit of insight into trying to calculate what that actually means. It's very difficult.
Yeah. So I guess, going back to Penny's question, the reality is, should something in this trial open a can of worms, that's not Justice Hall's concern nor his consideration?
That's my view. Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely right. All he is tasked with doing is judging this case, and as he must put any other consideration, whether it be for the feelings of Mr. Edwards' families or also the victims' families and media and all that other outside noise, he's just got to put it all to one side and just concentrate on what he's doing, and I'm sure that's what he'll do.
We have a very interesting observation from Louise in Hong Kong, who says she's interested to hear whether Justice Hall made any comments about attendees to the court needing to wear surgical masks. She's hearing in the courts in Hong Kong, they've been adjourned for the past 7 weeks since Chinese New Year, aside from very urgent matters. And over the past few weeks, while the judiciary has provided for a staggered reopening of the courts, they've mandated that all people entering court buildings, including lawyers and members of the public, must be wearing a mask or they're denied entry. So that's very interesting.
Yes, it is. With the shortage of masks in Australia at the moment, you might struggle to find one, even if you're as a high-powered lawyer as Damien is, I say. But no, he hasn't made that decree, I've got to say, but he has made it very clear that he would rather people not attend. He hasn't closed the court, but he would rather the public stay away for social distancing reasons, for their own health and safety, for the confidence that the court can remain open. And he's also, as I've said, put all the other measures in place, including hand sanitizer that he's personally supplied and all those type of things. And, of course, the audio transcripts of the proceedings. So he hasn't gone that far, Lois, but if he does, then I'm sure there'll be a run on masks down in Hay Street in Perth. I'll certainly have to go and buy one because I need to be in the court.
Good luck with that, Tim. Do you have a heads up on what's happening tomorrow?
Well, talking of that, we will be off to China in the morning via the wonders of modern technology to take a witness from there. This is a witness that is employed or was employed by Holden, and he will be talking to the particular materials and fibres that were used in that make and model of car at that time. But he was due to be in Australia, but he is now in China and obviously has to stay there for obvious reasons. So we'll be touching wood and everything else tomorrow to hope that the link for the video link from China is solid enough so that we can hear and see that evidence okay. And then after that, we think we might get to some of the more important or prominent ChemCentre witnesses who will actually a deep dive into the guts of the fibre evidence, and we might actually see some fibres up close and personal, and compare those, the ones found in the car to the ones found on Jane and Ciara. So that's where we think we'll be going for the rest of the week.
Yeah, well, as we said, no stone left unturned. Thank you both for your time today. If you have a question, drop us a line at clermontpodcast@wanews.com.au, and we hope you can join us again tomorrow for day 67 of Claremont in Conversation.
This podcast was produced by Kate Ryan and Alicia Preedy and recorded in the studios of 7 West Media. Audio files were provided from the archives of the 7 Network and the West Australian. Sign up for daily emails and all the latest on the Claremont trial at thewest.com.au.
For a fresh take on the news that matters, tune in to WA's newest morning show, The West Live, with Jenna Clark at thewest.com.au. The West Live not only delivers on what the day's big news stories mean for WA with hard-hitting interviews and analysis, but it will also make you smile with light-hearted chats and local gossip. The West Live, like talkback radio, but without the interruptions. Listen live weekdays from 8:45 a.m. on thewest.com.au or catch up with the podcast.